Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we help you to encounter the love of God and live well in the modern world. I'm Christine Reagan.
And I'm Dennis Mueller.
A couple months back, we had an entire episode about suffering and the mystery of it all. And I remember having to edit that and needing to take a lot of breaks because I found it to be so heavy. Now, fortunately, today it gets worse. So if you thought that was bad, just wait. No. Today's episode is all about death.
Dun, dun, dun.
There we go.
Way to sell it, Christine.
Thank
Way to
you.
sell
Thank
it,
you.
right? That's great.
What are your thoughts about death? When you
It's
hear
coming.
death, like, what's your kind of one-word association?
It's around the corner.
On its way.
It's on its way.
Well, for you, certainly. You know, you're closer than I am. But
One foot in the grave already.
I think we do have that instinctual, like, wince about us. Like, ooh, yeah, that's a part of our life. We try to put it off and keep it at bay for as long as possible and not really focus on it. But then we're reminded of it, I think, constantly.
Yeah, it's always in our face. It's not something that we run to, and it's not something that we long to think about it, although it's been my experience that a lot of people who are up in years have a tendency to think about it more often, probably because they realize that the time is short.
I think the age and wisdom that comes along with life, too.
And I often see many times, I would say that my experience has been that the majority of those people are okay with it.
Yeah.
They're like, God, take me home.
I'm
ready."
hoping that at the end of all things that I get there, because I've heard that people are like, you kind of feel very done with what has gone on here, and you're ready to go to the next.
Yeah, it's like a Calgon take me away moment.
There we go. I'm sorry. What? What was that?
Well, that's my age showing. You don't remember that?
No.
No, that was a commercial.
I thought you were singing a Dixie Chicks song,
No,
which is
no.
Cowboy Take Me Away. And I'm like, this is very out of character for you. I don't know what's happening right now. Who's Calgon?
Calgon was, what was it? I think it was like a soap or something that was,
Oh.
and there was a commercial on TV, and it was just like, I don't know, a woman in a tub, and like, Calgon, take me away. It was just kind of escaping the world.
Is Calgon a person?
No,
Or some kind
I
of,
just
like,
told you it was a
deity?
soap.
Oh, what I'm saying is Calgon like Calgon Take Me Away. Was she
It's the name of the soap.
Oh, the soap. I thought you meant soap opera. That's what I'm thinking. I was like, oh, this is an ancient soap opera. This is terrible. We should start again. Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we make dated references that Christine doesn't get. And I usually get a lot of them. I think I can harken back to many older things because they had a lot of substance to them. But you lost me with that one.
Sorry.
Anyway,
I got more.
back to death, please. This is already feeling like a slow death. Please. Let's get back to the task at hand. As a Catholic, death really should be on our minds in a very healthy way. And we should talk about it. I think we should say the right things about it. So that's really what we're going to try to do. We want to approach death today, just verbally, and we want to speak the truth about it. It's a topic that we shouldn't refrain from because no one's getting out of this life without going through it. It's one of the guarantees of life, unfortunately.
And it's
like taxes.
Well, taxes, they might be guaranteed, but you don't have to pay them. It's really the only guarantee in life is the fact that we're going to die.
It's guaranteed. It's going to happen.
Guaranteed. That is the one guarantee that we do have in life. The only guarantee in life is that all of us are going to face death. And even though death can sometimes come across as a dirty word that no one wants to talk about, for us as Christians, our joy really lies in knowing that our passing from this life isn't the end of our lives. Physical death in this realm is the first of what the church has traditionally referred to as the four last things.
Yeah.
They do kind of roll off the tongue
Because they're spoken of like
together.
one reality, the last stuff you have to approach. There you go.
Which is death, judgment, heaven, and hell. These are things that really lie beyond what we're experiencing right now. So over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to chat about these four mysteries and begin to consider them in the way our faith encourages us to. Because it's not about all fear and trembling when it comes to death and purgatory and the life after this.
Right. We have to think about it and approach it the way that the saints, the way that very holy men and women throughout history have. And that's what I'm really hoping will come out of.
They actually
what we're
had
gonna
their
do here.
eye on that.
Yeah, they're waiting for it.
They're waiting
because
for
they
it.
know
They're living
they
in
see
expectation.
things the way God sees them. So they're not so focused on the here and now. Yeah. Our life here is really meant to give way to another, one that is totally perfect and permanent. And we're people of hope. How often have we talked about hope in the past?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know of a greater exercise of that hope than in facing the reality of death. We believe there is glory and power on the other side of death. So how can we acknowledge that and then prepare for it wisely and virtuously?
And we have to remember what hope is. It's not just trusting that God will deliver on his promises, but knowing with absolute certainty and conviction that he will deliver on those promises. And that's where the hope comes from. The hope is the expectation that we will behold the beatific vision of God in heaven. And as Christians, we live our lives waiting in hopeful expectation that we will one day be in perfect communion with the God of the universe, the God who is love and who loves us like no other.
And that's what we're doing here. We're preparing for death in some sense. It sounds kind of morbid, but the moment that we're born, we're one step closer to death. But then we have to remember that that death gives way to eternity, eternal life.
I always looked at death more as like just another birthing process.
Oh, have you been through it? I'm sorry. What? Please, tell me something I don't know.
Well, let me explain, and then you can tell me whether I'm right or not. If you think about it, we start off nice and secure in our mother's womb, having all of our needs met. We're being totally cared for in that little cocoon of the womb. Life is seemingly perfect as we lay there in the fetal position, and then we see the light as we're born into a whole new world. And in that birth, we have an opportunity to really discover who we are and who God has called us to be. And there are times when life will make you want to curl back up in that fetal position.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
But when death comes, we again see the light as we are born into not just a whole new world, which is heaven, but really a whole new existence where we finally become who we were created to be, a saint living in perfect communion with God for eternity. So I think, again, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you talk to any mom, most will tell you that the birthing process is hard.
Affirmative.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. I was just waiting. I was like, feeling like...
Sorry, I had a flashback, and then I had to... There you go.
It makes sense then that death too would be hard for most people. But our perception of death is really the key to whether we approach this transition from one life to the next with wonder and awe, or if we go down kicking and screaming. And that's
you redeemed yourself with all that. That's very true.
Thank you.
There's nothing about, just speaking from experience, there's nothing about the hardness of birth that has made me not want to go back and do it again. Those people that are like, oh my God, the minute you see your baby, though, you just forget all the pain. No, you do not. No, you do not. I would challenge that with every fiber of my being. But you remember other things more vividly, too.
Right.
You know, and that's why you want to give birth to something else and someone else.
I guess you would say that seeing your baby's face for the first time makes everything that you had to endure worth it. And I think you could say the same of heaven.
Yeah.
Like once we get there and see that beatific face of God, that beautiful vision, oh my gosh.
Well, I think it certainly makes the work of redemption just from God's perspective.
Yeah.
You know, does he not remember the pain and the suffering of all that? I think he certainly does. But he wouldn't choose to not go through that all over again if he had to. It's once and for all, but he's eager and willing to save his people.
For love of
us. Yeah. Yeah, you talked about kicking and screaming. Sometimes our kicking and screaming is due to having to leave things behind. We don't want to let go of the things of this world. We're comfortable in how settled we are.
We got a death grip on it.
And oh man, we are white knuckling everything about this life. But everything we experience here is temporary. And the notion that things are permanent is just, it's facade. It's this illusion. We're fooling ourselves.
Can't take it with you, right?
You can't. And you're fooling yourself to a certain extent. And we find ourselves clinging to things that we think will prolong the process. The next fountain of youth product from the corporation that's just trying to sell you stuff and make money.
From Calgon.
From Calgon. All right, sure. Right. The soap opera from the 1940s that Dennis watched as a child. No. So there's nothing wrong with wanting your body to feel good and to be healthy, right? All of that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's important
Treat
too.
your body well. But sometimes I think we really think that we're going to cheat death to some extent. And there's no face cream and there's no procedure that won't eventually make you check out of this hotel.
Well, unless it's the Hotel California.
I know that
Because apparently there you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Never leave. Oh, that's well done. Good reference. So wait, the Hotel California, is that supposed to be hell? What's the meaning behind that whole song? There's got to be layers there.
I just sang it. I really didn't explore the depth
But
of the lyrics.
think of the lyrics. I think it's talking about a place that you can.
Could be.
We'll look at it later.
Yeah, I'll save that for the episode on hell if there's a connection. There we go.
The Hotel Hell.
Yeah, Hotel Hell.
Going back to death, we think we can cheat it. we think we can just ignore it altogether and sometimes pretend that there is no end. So I think that's why people like vacation so much. You go on vacation and you forget about
Get away from it
all
all.
of your responsibilities. And to some degree, that's healthy.
Yeah.
But
You need that.
are we living our life as a perpetual vacation where we're just not considering the things that are really, really important and really true? Everything ends. And I think that endings are hard for us. And maybe it's in some way a recognition of death. You know, even when my shows end, if there's a show that I really like and I know, oh, there's only 2 episodes left, I don't even want to finish it because I don't want it to end. Because I know, okay, now my show has died. And all the feelings that went along with that show have also died.
That's tragic.
Right? It is tragic. I mean, talk about problems. My show is over. Do you like when things end? I mean, if I'm out to dinner with like another couple and we're having a great time and I'm looking up at the clock and I'm like, oh, I got it.
Well, why would you be looking at the clock if you're having a great time?
Well, because I have a babysitter and I have kids at home and I know that everything, I almost don't want to look at the clock.
If you're really
because I
having a good
don't
time,
want-
just
can you let
time
me
would-
get my story?
Time would just pass.
But I know that I have to get back to real life to some degree. And so I almost don't want that dinner to end or, you know, that time to die. We live in this series of beginnings and endings, and I think we have reactions to things
Right.
ending.
I'm okay with it. Something has to end in order for
You're
something
really okay
to
with things
begin.
ending?
Yep.
You're good with change?
I am okay with death.
Okay. But are you okay with change?
Change can be a little rougher because there's
You don't think there's a connection to death in some way?
No,
here?
I don't see it that way. Change. There's a lot of uncertainty in change because you don't know where the change is going to lead. So you're hesitant. You're not sure. Is this going to be a good thing? Is this going to be a bad thing? Is this going to be?
But you know God works all things together for good.
This is true, unless I'm the one forcing the change and it's not God's will, then it ain't going to turn out too well. But with death, my perspective on death has certainly changed. Part of that has been working with you over the years because that's like a near-death experience every day, which is conditioning me for my own
I'm
death.
preparing you well for the next life.
But no, when I was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 2011, that was a game changer for me because it really,
Yeah, I can imagine.
it forced me to kind of put things into perspective because you didn't know the uncertainty of everything. And the only thing that I had to really get me through that was to cling to my faith. And it took some time. I'm not going to be honest with you. I mean, it probably took me maybe about 5 years from that point to really be able to reconcile my own mortality and death. And I'm not afraid. I even approach funerals very differently. I know that I'll miss that person, that loved one, but I know with absolute certainty that I'm going to see them again.
Yeah.
There's nothing for me to worry about. My concern more so is for what I'm leaving behind in the sense that like, all right, well,
That's the Father in you too.
well, that's just like, I just want to make sure that no one's going to be struggling, those type of things. But that's not really a fear of death. That's a worry for them to make sure that they're not going to suffer in my absence more so. For me, death is, I'm okay with it.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not rushing for it.
Yeah.
But when it comes, I think I would be okay with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have I'm okay with the intellectual part of it. I'm not so much okay with, and I know all the things that we're going to say and I believe them wholeheartedly, but yeah, it's still a challenge because I haven't
is.
reached a level of maybe holiness that I need to.
Well,
We can talk
that's the
more about
difference between you and me.
We'll start with that one. So, oh gosh, where were we? How to get back? So why do we have to die at all? I think that's something else that people really struggle with. And that's a question that's pretty easy to answer, honestly,
Yeah.
within
We
our
have the
faith
answer for
and
that
a
one.
theological framework. We actually talk about it a lot, I
Yeah.
feel like. It's sin. And I don't think we need to belabor the point. Humanity dies because of the consequence of the sin of Adam and Eve and
Yep.
everything that we inherit because of that. And all the disorder that exists because of that sin in ourselves, in relationship, in creation. Death is a direct result of all that.
Yeah, death
this is
was-
not God's fault.
Yeah, it
This
wasn't,
is a-
and it wasn't
this
part
is
of
an
God's
us
plan.
problem.
Yeah, it's important for us to realize that God, the creator of the universe, did not create death. This isn't God's fault, and thankfully, He created a cure for death, which is Jesus Christ. As Jesus says, "No one can come to the Father except through me." So Jesus really is the means through which we are united with the Father in His kingdom, which is heaven. And the four last things are those realities that lead us to everlasting life. We have to work our way through them in order to get there. You got to die.
You have to die.
You have to die. And in a very positive sense, this is why we have to lean on our Christian understanding.
Yeah, maybe our minds want to do something else with it. That could be a temptation. It might just be an honest human reaction, and that's fine.
Listen,
it also
you
might
throw
be
somebody in the pool who does not know how to swim, and
yeah.
they are going to struggle
Yeah.
to keep from drowning. No one goes running off to face death.
In fact, our faith tells us not to do that. We don't need to go look for suffering. We don't need to go looking for death.
It's not something that is, it's a part of our human condition, but it's not something that we were created for.
No.
And so we have to realize that death is really, this is again a Christocentric perspective. Death is the means through which we enter into eternal life. It's not the final word. It's not an end, but rather an incredible beginning to what brings to fulfillment God's divine plan for each of us. I mean, we know that God has a plan for us while we are here in our earthly existence, but that plan is part of a larger plan to help us to grow in holiness so that we can be with God for eternity in the next life. I think if we approach death in that type of a viewpoint, it takes the fear out of it.
Yeah.
It's not something that we have to fear or that we have to dread. It's a change, and that's going to be something that we're all going to experience. But the beauty of it is that separation that we might fear from our loved ones, it's going to be temporary.
Yeah.
They're coming too. They're going to get there eventually. Yeah. There's no time in heaven, as we'll talk about.
I was just going to say that. We're so focused on how long things seem to take when we're here, and that weighs so heavily on us. When we die, or when one of our loved ones dies, and we entrust them to God's care, I mean, they're in God's concept of time now.
There goes that intellectual intimacy again.
Boom.
Boom.
There we go.
The benefit of there being no time in eternity is that 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. So my separation might seem like 1,000 years in my heart, but really, it's the blink of an eye, and they're with us.
Yeah.
Again, it's different. It's different. And that's something that we really, really struggle with in this concept of eternity. And we'll talk more about this when we get into heaven and hell, but we really struggle with this concept because we are creatures of time. Yeah. We live in time. Time rules and governs our day and our lives. And all of a sudden, to not have to be accountable to time, there is no time. Well, none of us know what that's like.
Yeah.
It's
right.
different.
You're talking about how comfortable we are with time. And just a few moments ago, we talked about how comfortable we are with the white knuckling through life that we do here. Yeah. It reminded me of this thing that I wanted to read. So this is from a book called The Four Last Things,
which Christine just happened to have on her desk.
I just happened to have ready to go. And actually, in case it came up, I did have it earmarked. So here we go.
Here you go.
This author, who's the author? The author is Regis Martin. Martin says this. He says, in short, we have grown so insensibly settled into the mere semblance of life that we can scarcely conceive of any other state of being.
Yeah.
Now, I've realized that that's not groundbreaking, but it just made me think we can't conceive of anything being any different than what we have grown accustomed to.
Because that's our experience.
Whether it's the way in which time is processed or just the things that we do and how we do them. And we just get so settled.
Yeah.
We just can't think about anything else.
We want to live forever.
We do. And we make jokes about that too, myself included. I always say, I'll never die. I'll wait till they figure out how to freeze people and then unfreeze them. Or, I say things all the time like, I'll never die and I want to remain here. And I always, I tell Sean, like, I'm never signing like one of those DNR things. You keep me hooked up to every single thing because one day they're going to be able to unhook me and I'll be fine. But do you really want to live like that? Do you really want to remain here? I have to think about that myself. Do I really want to stay permanently separated from my true home and my creator?
Yeah.
Do I want to live a life that's never fully being perfectly loved and never really realizing that? Do I want to stay caught up in this cycle of sin and suffering? If I really think about it and take all the jokes out of my system, no thank you.
Right.
I have no interest in that. If we think about death in that way, like it's a remedy for sin and all the problems that it causes, sin is so destructive to me. I'm physically engaged in this earthly battle day after day, and I'm tired of doing it. And towards the end of my life, if I do this for another 50 years, I'm going to be even more tired. And so I can't do that forever, and I wasn't meant to.
Yeah. If I did it for another 50 years, I'd be dead.
With me or with
no,
if I had to deal with you for another 50 years?
With you, it might be a lot sooner.
That's true. But Teresa of Avila says this. She says, I want to see God, and in order to see him, I must die.
Yeah.
Right? If we think about and process death as just the way in which we are going to be reunited with our true heavenly home and the one who loves us and made us, that's going to
And Avila could say that
help
because she
us
was the
here.
one who was in that divine ecstasy,
She-
that moment that we talked about
Yeah.
in last week's episode.
Death is a consequence of sin, but it's also a solution to the problem, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it. It's funny how that kind of works out. Paul says in the New Testament that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And he's speaking about the work of Jesus and how he defeated death by undergoing all of it.
Right.
Well, doing that allows us to follow him into death and come to life. That's the whole Christian experience. And that culminates in like the resurrection of the body. Death was transformed by Christ, and then we get to participate in the great triumph that he has already had and seen and given us. Romans says, if we live with the Lord, we will die with the Lord.
Yeah. That's
You know?
it.
If I get to be victorious at the end of this, no, I don't want to be here for any longer than God has planned for me.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what is death?
Tell us.
Okay. Well, we use the word end a lot.
Yeah,
we've
it's
used it
like a
lot in this-
misnomer.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
use this a lot in our conversation. We talk about it's the end, but it's not an ending to the point where we cease to exist. And that's a very, very important distinction. That's the atheistic view of death. It's final, it's the end, there's nothing else
Yeah, it's
after
just giving
you die.
away to nothingness.
That's it.
Ugh.
The Christian view is full of hope, as we've already mentioned. To be human is to have both a body and a soul. This is what makes us human beings. While our bodies are certainly mortal, they age, sometimes not so well, and eventually die, our immortal soul is eternal. If you think about it, our soul is really who we are. It's our essence.
More us than
It's the
what we
essence of
see.
ourself,
Yeah.
yeah. And that can never be destroyed. And death is when our soul is separated from our body, but the separation is meant to be temporary. It's not meant to be forever. And that separation will last until Jesus comes again in glory at the end of time and the resurrection of the body occurs. This is what we pray in the Creed. Until that day comes, we exist in a diminished state in heaven or in hell because only part of what makes us human exists in eternity until that time. Because there's a separation of the body and the soul.
That's one of the few things we actually know about death. We were talking even before we started recording. We're talking about these four last things. We don't really know a lot about them.
Right.
We know what Scripture has told us, but we're not really speaking about things from experience. This is an area that we have to lean on the things that God has revealed. We
Yeah.
have to lean so heavily into divine revelation.
Yeah, it's
And-
important because that's the source. It's Jesus who spoke about heaven and hell more than anybody else and really kind of helps us to understand what the nature of those places are and the value of death.
Yeah.
Just taking a look at the cross. Just be mindful that at the resurrection of the dead at the end of time, our souls will be reunited with a glorified body. And
If we go to heaven.
if we go to heaven. So we're going to save that conversation for when we explore heaven and hell. But one thing is certain in the Christian view of death, and that is that we do not end.
Yeah, God is the only end that really exists. He's the ultimate end.
Right.
And that's why the church uses words like Alpha and Omega to describe God. In death, God calls man to himself. The Catechism says that. That's our eternal end. So the
Right.
only end that we're really talking about is God himself. Eschatology, right? The eschaton, if you want to get really fancy. When my dad was on the episode a couple weeks ago, he talked about Flannery O'Connor's, like, everything that rises has to converge. Where has it converged? To the ultimate end point. That's always the image that I have there. And so what stands between me and salvation, hopefully, goes back to what Teresa of Avila says. It's only death. Death is the only thing that separates me from my salvific end point, if you will.
Well, sin and death, I would say. I mean, death would be the final piece of that, but sin really stands in the way of my salvation.
Oh, sure.
too.
I mean, sin is something, I don't know if those two things really have to be together. I'm talking about, like, at the end of my life, the only thing that stands in, okay, all right, fine. Yeah, all right. I guess you're talking about the active participation of it. I'm assuming that all of that has been kind of minimized in my life, right? If I can overcome temptation and sin.
Christine, God's
Which-
doing
what I'm-
all the work.
Oh my gosh.
All we need to do is participate.
Really struggling with you today. But, but that's supposed to be the life of a saint, right? You have diminished sin in your life.
Yes,
Now I'm getting to
yes.
the point where, okay, I'm preparing
Right.
for death. I may not want to die.
I think we'll touch upon that a little bit yet.
But death is the last thing that separates me from eternal joy.
Yes.
Real joy. Joy. No, we don't have to usher that in on our watch. We're not saying in any way of like, oh, if death is the only reason that I'm not with God right now, well, then I'll just kill myself. No,
No.
that's not what we're saying. Right?
Right.
Everything has to be in God's time. in his time and in his wisdom, I will no longer be separated from him because I was never intended to stay with this distance that already exists. I love this image. If death is a falling, and I think this is actually in this book that Martin wrote somewhere. I wouldn't have come up with this myself. But he said, the only falling that exists in death is falling into the hands of God. And I just,
It's a beautiful
that's
image.
a totally different way. I don't know that it's in there. Maybe there's a reason that that's on my mind. I forget
Yeah.
who said it. But again, God, the Alpha and the Omega. Think about the two hands holding you, the Alpha and the Omega. The British author Henry James said that life is the predicament which precedes death. I think it's life that actually makes death really difficult.
I like that
right?
predicament.
It's Adam and Eve felt it. I feel it today, right?
Yeah.
This is not God's fault. This is not God's problem. Life
This is quite
the
a predicament
problem.
for some.
Yeah, you're not kidding. Life is the predicament, right? What's really ailing us? It's not death. It's not the reality of death. That certainly is part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But what's really bothering us are the circumstances that this life presents because of sin and its effects. Death is included in that.
Yeah.
But life is the problem, folks.
It's a great view.
Yeah. You would need a British author to tell you that.
I probably would,
A James
yes.
Joyce contemporary. I don't know if he was. I think they were somewhere around the same time. I think he's a little older.
So why do you think there's so much fear and trembling then?
I think there's a lot of fear and trembling because maybe we know we're not ready to some degree.
Yeah,
maybe
or we're
there's an
afraid to let go.
apprehension. Maybe we're afraid to let go, but I think maybe there's some apprehension of, have I really, I don't want to say achieved because we're not achieving anything, but would I go to heaven? Like if I were to die right now, would I actually go to heaven? I wonder if maybe the saints had that too towards the end, just because they could see so clearly into their own hearts, having such a keen sense of the heart of Christ too. And wondering if those two things matched up.
Well, I believe that they would have, only because if I am living in a state of holiness, I'm acutely aware of my unworthiness, but even more acutely aware of God's love and mercy.
That's true.
And that's going to trump any sense of unworthiness that I might feel or be struggling with.
Right.
God's going to have that final say, and that's my hope.
Yeah. Who wrote The Imitation of Christ? Is that de Montfort or is that the author of this? Oh gosh, who wrote that? I think it's Ligori.
All right, I'm looking it up.
Look it up.
Just
All
give me
right.
a second.
So the quote says this.
We got to get a guide
Why
for
is there
this.
so much fear and trembling? I know. We need an unpaid intern. Can we get a sacristan in here to just... So The Imitation of Christ says this. Every action of yours, every thought, should be those of one who expects to die before the day is out. Death would have no great terrors for you if you had a quiet conscience. Then why not keep clear of sin instead of running away from death? If you aren't fit to face death today, it's very unlikely you will be tomorrow. That's a heavy quote. Think about that quote. If you aren't able to face the possibility of death today, you're not going to be able to face it tomorrow. We're afraid of it because we know we're not prepared for maybe the quality of our virtue, the quality of our love, the quality of our holiness.
Right.
It's just not where it needs to be for us to be confident that that's our eternal end. I offer this quote very trepidatiously because I worry that people who are overly scrupulous, many of the saints were, by the way, maybe that's kind of what I'm talking about. You're very holy, but you have a keen sense of yourself and maybe it's overly overdone. Don't take this in an overly scrupulous way. Now, I don't offer this quote for those of you who maybe struggle with scrupulosity. We have to remember that, we don't have to worry about what tomorrow. Am I going to be ready tomorrow? I'm not ready today. What if I'm not ready tomorrow? Conversion is experienced over the course of a lifetime. But I think it speaks to why we might fear death with that fear and trembling. But if I'm a saint, then perhaps I don't fear death in the same way. Maybe I can have the confidence of Paul and those early Christians who went to their deaths knowing that they would see the face of love soon.
That's a good point. Maybe that's why I don't fear death.
There we go. Do you think you're a scrupulous person?
No.
No, I would have said no. I can tell you're not.
No, I'm not.
We got to have an episode on scrupulosity. I worry about somebody who does struggle with scrupulosity, how they would hear every thought should be of someone who expects to die before the day is out. Take that with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that every single thought that you have has to be preparing for your death, which might be imminent and you don't know it.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about.
But
But
it's-
getting back to the matter at hand.
But no, but it's
something you
it's
wanna say?
it's the reason why it's an important quote because we live this out theologically in the church, don't we? I mean, this is the whole reason for Advent, the whole reason for Lent.
Yeah.
These seasons of the church, we become introspective and we
have to
talk about
revisit,
preparing.
yeah.
Are we prepared for the coming of Christ? Not just at Christmas in the creche, but are we prepared for when he comes again in glory? And if the
Yeah.
answer is no, well then now is the time. Seize the day and begin to prepare.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with Lent. You know, we're preparing for the resurrection. We're preparing for eternity. We're preparing for heaven during this season. And what do we concentrate on? We concentrate on our sinfulness. We concentrate on those things that are separating us from the love of God and that may prevent us from attaining eternal life. And so we're given a season to do something about it.
Yeah.
Prayer, fasting, almsgiving. It's preparation.
Yeah.
So the church takes, what is that, like 20% of the year of a focus for us as Catholics to really hone in on the need to be prepared. We
Yeah.
need to hear that message over and over
And
again.
if we're not preparing today, what's to indicate that we're going to prepare tomorrow?
That's
And
right.
the next day, and the next day, and the next day.
That's right.
So really, I think what this quote is saying is it has to start today. You need to start thinking about
Yeah.
death and eternity now, and don't just put it off. Because, you know, what's that quote? What should be done, what you're putting off today, and what's that old adage?
I don't know. I'm not that old.
Oh, God. Well, that's not true. But
I know Calgon, but I don't know that one.
there you go. I'm going to have to look up this Calgon. You know, somebody who hasn't strived to really live a good life can't have a good death. This is something that Robert Bellarmine talks about in his book. Here we go, Christine's book club, The Art of Dying Well. So
Jeez, keeps coming, folks.
This is Robert Bellarmine's book. He's a 17th century figure. But what
Saint.
Saint, yes, I thought that was a given. So his book here is called The Art of Dying Well. And what I think is interesting is that there's a longer title. It's called The Art of Dying Well. And then parenthetically, it says, or How to Be a Saint Now and Forever. It's almost like you think the book is going to be about this. It's actually about sainthood and holiness.
Yeah.
And yes, death is the constant topic, but it's about how saints really prepare for death in the lifetime of holiness that they're experiencing. Yeah. I love the much longer title of the book, but I would urge you to read it. I think it's wonderful. I was telling Dennis before that I think it's a great adoration book. And what he does is he presents the good life that a Christian is called to live as like an art form, right? We all want our lives to be a masterpiece, right? With God at the helm. We all want our lives to produce this great symphony in response to what God has already given us.
Well, think what St. Paul says, Ephesians 2:10. You are a masterpiece of God's creation. You are his handiwork. So
Yeah.
I think what Robert might be saying, and I have not read the book, but I would imagine that
Not
he's,
well read. Go ahead.
I'm imagining he would say to live as that masterpiece.
Yes. Yeah, the art of dying well. It's an art form. There's precision
Yeah.
to it. There's a stroke to it. There's a honing in of skills and talents and a utilization of gifts and
Right.
charisms
Don't sell
and all
yourself
of that.
short. Live as that masterpiece that God created you to
Right.
be.
And art, to go back to the imitation of Christ, art is not achieved overnight either. That's a lifetime of.
Honing your skills. Yeah.
And so the overall tone of the book is like twofold. He says, if you live well, you will die well. And so with that theme, he breaks it into two parts. He talks about dying well in good health and then dying well in a time that's closer to death. And those are kind of the two stages of life that we find ourselves in. You know, there's a time in which maybe we're more carefree about things. We're not experiencing sickness or suffering, but then maybe the tide turns and we have to focus on things in a very different way. So he speaks in the book and he writes in the book about those two different ways of life
Just out of
in
curiosity.
times of health and in times of sickness.
So when he's talking about dying in good health, is he talking about the times that we need to die unto self?
He's talking about the way in which you live the Christian life when death is not next door, basically.
And I really should read the book.
Yeah, it's really, really good because it's not just, it's for everybody, because maybe you are in a stage where you're like, I am sick, I am suffering, I maybe I am older, maybe I'm not.
Right.
But how do I cultivate my spirituality in this particular state of life that I'm in?
My curiosity's piqued.
Yeah. One of the best things I think he offers in the book is that he points out really the key of dying well is to die in this kind of mini fashion along the way. And he says that we have to die to the world before we really die to the body, or until we can even begin to digest death of the body. It reminds me of how many times in scripture that we're exhorted.
Jesus says it over and over again.
Yeah, to be in the world, but not of the world, meaning that we can't be attached to the things of sin and death, and we can't be attached to the prince of the world, who
Right.
is the devil. This is what Jesus meant by the narrow gate and all of that. And so we can't be so fond and consumed by the fleeting pleasures of the world that we develop an immoderate love for them. And that's something that Robert spends a lot of time on in this book. And there's nothing wrong with pleasures and richness and wealth and all of that. He points out that Christians can be rich in life. I'm waiting for it.
Everybody needs a little me time.
I think I'm in the
right?
wrong business for it. But he said there's nothing wrong with being rich. He points out that Abraham was rich, and there are many Old Testament figures who are rich. But we first have to be rich in faith. And that's that whole poor in spirit business that we've
Right.
talked about in the
Yep.
past. He says a big part of dying well is putting a stop to the people and the things in our lives and even ourselves that we make God. There's a way in which we can focus on that in a healthy season and in seasons that are drawing closer to this particular end. If we can go back to that word. You know, we can't live for this world, is what Roberts said. In long form, that's what he's saying. We can't live for this world. We have to live for the next. One of the key suggestions that he offers is there's a connection between fasting and understanding all of this. When we go without, it helps us detach from the things of the world. Not that they're bad.
Right.
Maybe they are bad, but
Right.
even if they aren't bad, we can cling to God and we can cling to the permanent things that we know to be real and to be true. It's a wonderful book. I really do highly recommend it. It's a short read, actually, and it reads very easily.
Yeah, it
So-
doesn't look that thick.
No,
I mean, it's
and even
maybe
the,
about a half
do you ever
inch.
open a book and you just look at how big the text is and how it's laid out? I
And
mean, is that not accessible?
No, it is. I'm
That's
very excited.
Wildly accessible. So here you go. I signed a copy for you.
Oh, awesome.
No, I'm just kidding. I didn't.
So how can we become more comfortable with the truth of death, the reality of death?
Yeah, I think we can say all these beautiful things about dying well and becoming detached and understanding our true home
You
and
know,
our
it's almost
creator.
esoteric.
It's still true, though. We still struggle with death because of the role that it played in our lives here. You know, we've lost loved ones. We've felt that pain. We felt that suffering. We've seen tragic situations unfold. All of that impacts how we process death in this finite realm.
And if we view our death like Christ's,
Game changer.
it really softens the visceral, those splanchnidzoma reactions that we have to it, right? We stand in faith knowing that Jesus' suffering and death liberated the entire human race from the effects of sin. Death has been conquered. And it's not the final say in one's life. And Jesus' resurrection allows us to really stand in hope that we too will share in this resurrection of our own bodies. Our death liberates us literally into the hands of God.
What does Paul say in Thessalonians, where the community is really down about those who have passed on? What does he tell them? I can't remember it at the moment. He talks about trusting and hoping that we will see our loved ones again.
He's assuring them that they have fallen asleep. That's the language that
Right.
the New Testament used.
There you
They
go.
have fallen asleep. It's not because death is not final. They often viewed things as final. There were many Jews that believed in the resurrection and those that did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. So it was a little bit of a mixed bag, even within the religious circles.
And he was stressing too that we have to entrust our loved ones into the merciful care of God, no matter whether they were a believer or not, that everything is in God's wisdom and design and power too.
Ultimately, we want to die well. And that requires us to trust in God's promises, having no serious sin in our soul, and being at peace with ourselves and our neighbors as much as this life allows. And that
And
could
sometimes
be,
we got to be the active agent of that
Yeah.
as much as we can, right?
Yeah, we need to kind of step up our game in that regard because it might not be coming the other way. We need to be the missionaries of mercy in that regard.
If we can do, there's only so much we can do, but if we can do those things, then dying is just simply going
Yeah,
home.
that's it.
And it sounds kind of like Pollyanna-ish. It's not. It's like, oh, I'm just going home. And you're like, whoa, that's heavy. It may be heavy, but is that not true too?
Yeah. It's very similar to that quote that you pulled earlier.
Yeah. Henry James.
There
but
you go.
ahead.
No, it wasn't Henry James.
Oh.
Yeah.
The
It was
imitation one?
The imitation,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. I've quoted, I've used very few words of my own today.
If you had a quiet conscience, death wouldn't be something to fear.
Yeah.
In the end, just strive to live a holy life. Go to confession frequently. If you're getting to confession once a year, which is the absolute minimum required by the precepts of the church, you might not be as prepared for death as you ought. If you haven't been to confession in some time, get back. Whatever reason you have for not going, ask God today for the grace to overcome those obstacles that are preventing you from receiving the sacrament.
Is it too strong to say whatever reason you have for not going back, it's not good enough?
Yeah, I would say
It's-
that. Yeah, it's just not
It
good
sounds
enough.
bad. And to be honest, maybe the church has played a role in why you're not going back.
Yeah.
That's also not good enough. I always tell people, especially when we're doing RCIA, I tell them if you have a bad experience in the confessional, you don't have to stay there in that encounter. You can go find another priest
Sayonara,
and have
Father.
a better sacramental
Yeah.
experience, you know?
Yep, yep.
So yeah, it's just not good enough to say,
I'm not doing it. Right. Or to do it infrequently. But most importantly, get to Mass and receive the Eucharist. You know,
by the way, this whole book has a huge chapter on the Eucharist.
the book that you're
And
holding up showing me,
book
but
that
not
I'm
telling
holding-
which book
Yeah,
with
there
all
we
the
go.
buck
The Art of
desk.
Dying Well.
There you go.
It has a whole chapter on the Eucharistic essential.
And there's a
quality.
reason for that, because Jesus made it explicitly clear that we must eat his flesh and drink his blood in the Eucharist if we desire eternal life. Again, no one comes to the Father except through me. So let our Holy Communion here in this world be a foretaste of the Holy Communion that we will experience in the next. There's a beauty to the Eucharist it's unprecedented. And keeping ourselves connected to a life of Christ is what really leads to our transformation, our ability to become the saints that God has really called and created us to be. Because if our ultimate destination is heaven, that's the end game. That is it. We will one day be saints if we get to heaven. But it has to start here. The process of sainthood starts here. It doesn't start when the church starts an investigation. They're already saints in heaven. We're
Right.
just acknowledging the fact. The process has to start here.
Yeah. This whole conversation reminds me of Bilbo at the end of Return of the King.
Of course it would.
It would. We all knew I was going to go there. He's heading to the Undying Lands. He's gotten to the end of his life. The Undying Lands are representative of eternal life. And he just says, he's walking to the boat and he says, I'm quite ready for another adventure. And he's happy. And it makes me tear up like a loser, to be honest. It really does. Prior to that, he's restless in his life. And aren't we? Aren't we also restless?
Yeah.
We can't rest eternally here. And so he looks at what's to come and he said, he recognizes it for what it is. It's a new beginning for him as his body in Middle Earth is failing him and all of that. Our end, which is really our beginning, is our eternal home and the place that God has prepared for us.
Yeah, we have to remember we're sojourners and foreigners in a foreign land. The church uses that language a lot.
Yeah, which,
in
by
its
the way,
writings.
why my Lord of the Rings reference is perfect because it's a strange land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
But we need to be always mindful that we are citizens of heaven. Just make sure that you don't get so comfortable in this world that you end up changing your citizenship for that other place with a much hotter climate.
There we go.
We don't want to go down that road. Christine has another book in her
No,
hands. For
I'm
the love
just-
of Pete.
Remind me.
Are you going to pull out quotes now?
No, I have quotes. It just what you said reminded me. Listen, I am far more prepared than you have ever been for an episode. I have books, I have coffee, I have all sorts of things. Okay, so let's begin to close this out with some quotes. Saint Therese says this. She says, "It is not death that will come to fetch me." Oh, see, I don't want to cry. It gets me.
Do you want me to read it?
No, I can do it. I'm a big girl. It's not death that will come to fetch me. It is the good God. Death is no phantom, no horrible specter, as presented in pictures. In the Catechism, it's stated that death is a separation of soul and body. That is all. Well, I'm not afraid of a separation which will unite me to the good God forever.
That's beautiful.
It's, oh my gosh. You wonder why she's a doctor of the church?
But do you see
it's
the-
because of stuff like this.
But do you see the perception?
Yeah.
Our view of death is so influenced by our perception that if we can begin to change how we perceive it, everything changes.
Yeah.
Everything, our reality changes. That's the key to being able to accept death. Like I said, when I was going through my cancer, it forced a change in my perception.
Yeah.
And now that I've had that change, it's changed my entire way of looking at things in many arenas.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely changed that.
Would you say that you're glad it all happened?
Oh my gosh, praise God. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Here's the final quote, okay, from St. Bernard, who's also wildly mystical. Love him. He says, "How consoling it is to see a just man die. His death is good because it ends his miseries. It's better still because he begins a new life. It is excellent because it places him in sweet security. From this bed of mourning whereon he leaves a precious load of virtues, he goes to take possession of the true land of the living, the citizenship. Jesus acknowledges him as his brother and as his friend, for he has died to the world before closing his eyes from its dazzling light. Such is the death of the saints, a death very precious in the sight of God."
It's nice.
It is.
Again,
All right.
It's a perception
Let me
thing.
put myself back together. You end this episode.
So one last thing. As we close out this first of the 4 last things, pray for a provided death.
That's language that the church has used for a very long time. What
Yeah.
does that mean for people?
Well, it's asking God to ensure that you have the opportunity to receive the sacraments before parting from this world, so that you are assured of dying in a state of grace.
Yeah, and it's also praying that you don't have a sudden, unexpected death.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That-
especially in some kind of tragic way. Now these things do happen,
Sure.
right? And God makes allowances for all these things. But if I had the option of picking how I'm going to die, I would
Go with
want to
that.
receive the Eucharist. I
Right,
would want
yeah,
to
go with that.
receive the sacrament of the sick and all the things that would prepare me to die well.
That is that. Well, I mean, it's beautiful because that's a sure ticket to heaven.
Yeah.
It's first class all the way. I mean, when my dad died of cancer back in 2017, the last thing that he asked me was to bring in a priest, and he had been away from the church for about 20 years. A good priest friend of mine, Father Bill Kaufman, came to visit him. Came up from vacation down in Delaware, drove up to University of Pennsylvania Hospital, administered last rites, heard his confession, gave him communion, and next day he died. And my dad was in a perfect state of grace, a perfect state of holiness in that moment. I know where he's at.
Yeah.
You know, that's my, like, I was not upset. I mean, I miss my dad, but I know I'm going to see him again.
You do process death really well. There have been times, here at this church where people have died, and I have looked to you to see how you're handling that. Not to say that you have to handle it well all the time. I don't mean to put that, but I do see that reflected in how parishioners here have passed away and people who we have known well have passed. And so,
I always try to remind people, too, that there's a beauty to this theology that we have. So when you lose someone that you love, faith tells us that if they're in heaven, they are now one of the greatest advocates that we have.
yeah.
And what they're doing up there is doing exactly what they did here on earth. They are loving you and they are praying for your salvation. They know what awaits and they want you to be there. So what do you think they're doing up in heaven? Right? They ain't playing tiddlywinks. They ain't learning the harp. They are working in earnest.
Are these
In
the ancient
earnest.
games you played as a child? They're not playing jacks up there on the stoop, on the steps, waiting for the milkman to deliver, our monthly portion of, I don't know.
Oh, for the love of Pete. On that note,
Pray to St. Joseph. St. Joseph is the patron saint of a good death. The Catholic
Yeah.
tradition holds that St. Joseph died in the loving presence of Jesus and Mary. Isn't that what we all want to? So
Yeah.
St. Joseph there is
Amen.
always
Amen.
one of the greatest advocates for us,
All right.
aside from God himself. I love when you go all right, because then you're like, all right, shut up. All I hear in my head is, all right, he wants you to stop talking now. That was a good one. I felt good about that.
good.
We'll see how it turns out.
Well, we still have to wrap up the episode, so before you
I
sign off
know.
there.
No, that was
Okay.
I'm bringing a level of authenticity to this.
okay.
This is real life. We're going to talk next episode all about judgment. We're going through the 4
Yep.
last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell.
Well, I can't wait for that one.
There's a lot to look forward to.
A lot of confusion, too.
If you're listening to these things to learn,
Yeah.
I think you will learn the most about judgment. I just set the bar very high for us. We have to
Well.
make sure we have some good content. But if you want to reach out to us, we can always be reached at mmlpodcast@outlook.com. Our website is mmlpodcast.com. I'm not used to saying that because it's kind of new, but we.
And you can put in prayer requests there. I don't know if
Yes.
anybody's seen that, but there's a means for you to put in prayer requests on our website. Christina and I will be happy to pray for you, and if that's something that you're interested to, hop on to the website and shoot us a prayer request.
Sounds good. We'll see you next time.
All right. God bless.